We'll go ahead and get started. So for all of you, so thrilled that you're here to join us today. I'm Justin Clifford. I work at Bereave. I'll be your host today. Loss Leaders is a program really centered around how companies could, and frankly, we think should, step up when loss occurs in the lives of their employees. And the reason we do these programs is that Bereave is on a mission to help companies provide the absolute best possible bereavement response when their employees suffer a loss. And in that pursuit, we get to talk to and meet incredible people that can just bring so much insight and so much education to business leaders who are working to build a more compassionate and empathetic workplace. So this is our effort to get them in front of you. The chat is open, as you'll see. We'll monitor for questions. We'll get to them as we go. So if you have them, fire away, and we'll try to get to those. We'll probably go to roughly 40 minutes past the hour, 45 past the hour, and we'll have recordings out to you by the end of the week. So Christina Brady is the CEO, co-founder, and CEO at Lustre. She's held all sorts of leadership roles and has been a people manager for well over a decade at companies like Glassdoor, Speckit, Groupon, all companies that you may or may not be familiar with, probably at least Groupon at the very least, Glassdoor, obviously. And that's what you'll see in her LinkedIn profile, right? If you cruise her LinkedIn profile, which we will link to in our follow-up. But what you won't see, like so many others, is that she belongs to the biggest club in the world, which is the Grievers Club. Today, she's going to share how her own loss has impacted the way she thinks about work and leading and managing people. So, Christina, welcome to Loss Leaders.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. What a beautiful introduction. I'm just honored. That was wonderful. And hi, everybody. It means the world to have people here who care and want to hear these stories. It's just awesome.
Yeah, well, very, very generous of you on multiple levels, not just the vulnerability that it takes to be here and to have this conversation, but and the strength, but also, you're a co-founder and a CEO at a very early stage company, and your time is money, literally. So thank you so much, Christina. Let's start a little bit about with your grief journey. And you and I have not connected. We've connected on many things, mostly go-to-market stuff, but we have not connected deeply on this. So this is going to be a pretty raw conversation for you and I. Can you talk a little bit about the experience that brings us here today?
Yeah, absolutely. You and I've always kept it so tactical and friendly. Goes without saying that, Justin, you're a really, really wonderful person to see you be the CEO of a company doing this. Is just giving back in a way that people like me or anybody that has dealt with grief, it just means the world to hear this talked about. And one of the reasons that I'm trying to be more open with my story is because so many people struggle and they don't know how to talk about it. They don't know if they can talk about it. And so if I have this phrase behind me that says, make it mean something. And it's my life mantra of we're going to go through really, really difficult things. And the way that we honor ourselves and potentially the people that we've lost or that we're supporting is to make that journey mean something. And if you can help at least one person to get through their own journey, then it means more than anything. And you're doing the people around you such an honorable service. And so my grief journey started when I was young, when I was 18 years old, going into my first year of college. My mom found a lump in her breast that turned out to be very, very early breast cancer. And she went into a bit of depression about that. And I think couldn't quite face the fact that as a single mom of three kids, I don't think she wanted to be sick or knew how to deal with that. And so she chose not to undergo any form of treatment and try sort of natural remedies through that. And I don't know if anybody listening has watched somebody on that journey or is aware of it, but it's a very, very difficult journey to watch. And so over the course of 2 years, she fought like hell until finally, when I was 20, we lost her to breast cancer that had metastasized all over her body. And then actually, just under a year after that, my dad also died of alcoholism, complications of alcoholism, cirrhosis of the liver and full body infection. And My parents were separated at the time, but both of them were musicians and artists. And one thing you know about that is, one, you can't give back to the world in a better way than being an artist, because your legacy lives on. Both my parents are Googleable. I can find their music, which is unbelievably comforting. But at the same time, those jobs typically are not W-2 positions, and they don't come with things like insurance policies and benefits. And neither of my parents had life insurance. Both of my parents were young. My dad was 49. My mom was 54. And both of them didn't have a trust. They didn't have a will. They didn't have anything written in the estate in terms of what would happen in the event that they passed away. And both of them were deeply, deeply in debt. And so when they passed away, this was around 2007, 2008, when there was the housing crisis going on. And it was just me, my older sister, who was a year older than me, my younger sister, who was 16. She was still in high school. The bank foreclosed on our house. We were locked out of it. They did an estate sale where people came in and bought all of our possessions to try and pay back some of the debts. So like my prom dresses and my mom's paintings and her jewelry and everything that she had ever meant to be left to us and part of her legacy, we couldn't be a part of. And after losing the house, I was still in college trying to get through it. And so I actually spent about 6 to 8 months homeless. And when I say homeless, I was lucky in my state of not having a home, because I had a lot of friends that lived in the city. I had friends that lived on campus. I didn't have much. I had no money. I had no inheritance. I suddenly had to pay my way through college and figure out a way to get my younger sister through school, because my older sister had kind of some troubles of her own at the time. And so, you know, I'm one of those people. I learned very early on that the red line in Chicago goes for 24 hours. And if you sit in the front car right behind the conductor, it's relatively safe. And like, you can sleep there and the train will just keep moving and you can get through the night that way. I learned that if you make friends with the security guards at the Nordstrom on Michigan Avenue, they'll let you come in and use their bathroom to brush your teeth and to bathe in and to look good and presentable for going to class. And it changed the entire direction of where I wanted to take my life. You know, previously I had these dreams. I'm a former improv performer. I did a little bit of commercial work and some theater work, and I wanted to go to California. I had an agent before they both passed away, and I was like, I'm going to be in a sitcom. This is going to be it for me. I can't wait. And I had to pivot, and I had to make money really, really quickly, because my younger sister was in a bad position. She had to get through school. And so I sort of dropped that dream. And when she got to a point where she really was in a bad spot, I said, okay, I need to make some money really fast. It's one thing for me to be couch surfing and sleeping on trains and living this nomadic life while I'm trying to get my way through college, deeply, deeply in debt myself. It's quite another thing that my younger sister, who is a minor, needs help and needs somewhere stable that she can go. And so I sort of fell into sales that way. I got all of my licensing and became a licensed financial planner with MetLife, and was selling insurance. And I was really good at it. It's just like, who would have thought, really good at it. And then I was able to get enough money and get an apartment, and she moved in with me. And kind of that was the journey from there. And that was sort of my younger difficult journey. The second piece that I'll touch on for a moment, because I know that it is so relevant to people in the workplace today, is after I got married with my husband, we were obviously trying to have a baby. It wasn't working. I went through 4 years of infertility, multiple miscarriages, multiple rounds of IVF. I was actually at a former job pregnant. Nobody knew that I was pregnant. And I started to miscarry while I was at work. And I was the leader of an organization, and I felt like I couldn't tell anybody. And I'm in the bathroom and I don't know what to do and where to go. And it's just, your mind goes a million miles a minute. And then, you know, you have to think about, like, can I cancel my 4 p.m. meeting because I think I'm having a miscarriage, you know? So it's those moments where, and that's just what I've learned, is that these moments of grief, they happen to us, and we have to find a way to deal with them in the moment. And we're often so underprepared for it, as other people around us.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that. I mean, I feel like we could, I don't know, have a couple hour lunch, you know, and I could ask a lot of questions if at some time you're open to that. But I want to kind of back up, because you mentioned a couple of things that were, made me feel like not many people knew about these things in your life, these moments that have occurred. Is that the case, or was this a pretty public journey. I know you mentioned the pregnancy loss, like both of these situations, all of these situations, seems like were relatively private to you. Is that the case?
Yeah, I would say half and half. I've tried
Mhm.
in appropriate moments to share bits and pieces of my story where
Mhm.
appropriate. But the other
Sure.
thing that I think so many people who have gone through immense grief, whatever that means to you, is you feel like you're stealing the spotlight when somebody is
Mm.
sharing their grief, and then you're like, "Me
Sure.
too." It feels sometimes like I'm
Right.
pulling the spotlight away from you. It also sometimes feels like you're burdening other people with
Sure.
having to figure out the right way to respond. And that's what
Mm.
I remember
Mhm.
feeling for all of these years was you tell somebody this story and now you've just given somebody the burden
Yeah.
of I have to have the perfect response that like do I say
Sure.
I'm sorry? Do I, and so I try to, and I've tried to be a very open book to share where applicable, but I certainly
Mhm.
haven't gone around and just openly offered
Right.
that a lot of people don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. What about in the moment? Like, you're sleeping on trains, you're using the Nordstrom to get ready for class. Like, who knew about this?
Nobody.
Who knew that you had lost your parents?
Um, Actually, what's interesting is everyone knew at my school that I had lost my parents because I was out
Okay.
for a couple of weeks and I got a lot of outpour.
Okay.
And then the certain friends that I had who would let me couch surf and stay there
Sure.
and all of that, like they obviously knew that I didn't have a place, but
Mhm.
I was afraid to say anything. I was afraid, what if
Sure.
I get kicked out of school? What if I'm unable to graduate? What's going to
Mhm.
happen? Am I going to get pulled into the system somehow, even though I was an
Sure.
adult? So I
Right.
really, in the time, and I even today, like I very much downplay that experience.
Mhm. Yeah. I just think there are, we hear from people all the time that say things like nobody knew, right? Didn't tell work. I didn't tell my colleagues. I didn't tell many people in my family about this. Like things just happened. And there was a lot of reluctance to share for a multitude of reasons, right? But that I get to thinking about managers and leaders in the workplace specifically who have this workforce that is potentially suffering in silence in a lot of situations. And that's kind of where my mind goes here. So like, can you talk a little bit about, I understand kind of how things played out, into getting, joining an insurance sales team, right? How has this journey sort of uh lived in you and your growth in your career, especially as you have evolved into a leader?
Yeah. It was interesting because I spent a good amount of time, it's like when you're in it, you don't necessarily realize or acknowledge that you're in it. It's not until
Mhm.
you're removed or things have changed where you go, my God, did I just did I just do that? Like it's this moment where when you're in it, this is just what life looks like. And it's just
Mhm.
getting through it. And for me, this feeling of I don't have a safety net. I still don't. I
Mhm.
don't I don't have anybody that if I get into financial trouble or what like I don't have and I've never had that person I can call to be like I need help. So that
Sure.
opportunity for help I realized very quickly it doesn't exist for me, doesn't exist for my sisters. And so my attitude then was okay, well step 1 is to get into a place where I don't need help because
Mhm.
that fearful burden. The second is how do I become that person in this family or that person in my friend group or that person to the people that I love where when they need help they know that I can help them because if I can avoid somebody that of that feeling of I have nowhere to go, you have me to
Mhm.
go, and it's like
Yeah.
so that's another way of again like making it mean something. So in the year
Mhm.
following it was how do I get to a point where I can make enough money to be stable and help the immediate people around me?
Mhm.
And I found that this experience immediately had given me a level of tenacity that I didn't even realize, right? Like I knew
Sure.
what a bad day was to me.
Mhm.
Bad day was. So going into sales and having somebody hang up on me or be rude
Sure.
to me or not closing a deal or end of
Mhm.
month pressure, not to downplay that, but in that moment
Mhm.
as an individual contributor, I was like,
Mhm.
bring it on. You're going to hang up on me. Guess what? In your honor, I'm going to call 10 more people in your
Right.
eyes. It was like, it became this element of tenacity, like, you are not going to be the one that's going to take me down. I don't think so. And then, so that evolved into me almost embracing it as an individual contributor and being like, no, I'm going to take this narrative back. And then the way that it turned into me as a leader, I mean, it even evolved even more from there, because then it turned into the perception of, how do I, as much as I can control, and even as a frontline manager, even sometimes as a VP of sales or a CRO, you can't always control it. But how do I make sure the people in my purview understand that I know that the human experience comes with joy and pain and grief, and you being at work doesn't put a stop to that. And so how do we make that a part of your daily experience? And how do I make it okay for you to show up the way that you need to at work, or decide that maybe today's not a day that you need to be at work? Like, and people don't talk about that enough either.
Yeah. I would love to dig into that, like because you come with a very holistic view of the human, despite the walls that they're in, or the hours of the day, like that they're on the clock, right? You're thinking beyond that, right? And I want to come back to that. I'm curious because you suffered these losses and almost went immediately into like the business side of life with bankruptcy and estate sales, and then realizing, oh shoot, I'm in survival mode now. Like, when were you able to process, even with your sisters or solo, like when were you able to process the loss, the grief, the mourning that came with those losses?
As much as I would love to say I had a very healthy process by which what I've learned about grief is, in the high level answer is, I don't know that I fully have. I don't know that I ever will. I used to think that the way that grief worked was, over time, like, grief first happens and it's this big encompassing thing that impacts everything physically, mentally. All you can feel and see is the grief, and everything is covered and colored by that grief. And I used to think over time that grief gets smaller and smaller, and never that it disappears, but the grief gets smaller. I've learned that it doesn't actually work that way. Your life can get bigger around the grief, but the grief doesn't get smaller. I mean, to this day, I will have moments where something big will happen in my life. I'll be playing with my son who's 6 now. And he'll grab something on the table, and I'll look and I'll go, oh my God, that's my mom's hand. Like, he's got my mom's hand. I want to call my mom and tell her. And then it's that moment where you experience the loss all over again. You constantly in life have to remind yourself and go, oh, that's right. I can't call my mom and tell her that her grandson has her hands, or I can't call my dad and say, my God, he's got your blue eyes. So there's these moments where you can't, the processing it is really just learning to live with it and acknowledge the fact that, like the Kool-Aid man, it's going to bust in the room and you're not expecting it to. And you're going to have to be like, hey, give me just a second. I'm not going to ignore you, but like, give me a minute and then we'll get there. And I cannot talk about things like therapy, sometimes medication if you need it. We don't talk about that a lot, but like, grief really messes up your serotonin levels, and having a way to process that is so, so powerful. I think companies should provide those services for people. Just a quick shout out, but like that is something that I think is ultimately really important.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. You kind of touched a little bit on like a lot of it on the mental side of it, but for somebody who hasn't experienced a close loss, can you talk a little bit more about how grief kind of manifests mentally, which you've started to touch on, but also physically, for to help people understand what their teammates might be going through, especially when they return from a leave?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Absolutely. And one thing I'll say about grief too is, I always say that to compare is cruel. And there are no levels of grief, right? Like, grief is not on a scale where you sit down with your people and you say, okay, we're going to plot out here what grief actually allows you to feel sad or hurt, and then what grief you should just get over really, really quickly, right? Like, let's look at the loss of a pet versus the loss of a parent, right? So grief, I mean, to a 3-year-old that breaks their favorite crayon for the first time, the grief can feel as deep as an adult losing somebody because they've never yet felt something that is that intense. And so the first thing that I will say to anybody working in an organization in a leadership position is resist the urge to measure people's grief in your own mind and in theirs, right? Everybody processes grief very, very differently. And the first gift that you can give to people is simply asking them how they're doing, how the grief is hitting them. Sometimes you'll ask people, what do you need? And they don't know the answer to that. And so the biggest thing that you can do is, one, when people come back from grief, is listen to them. Don't try to solve, don't try to ideate, don't try to solution.
Sure.
And that's what I hear people do a lot, right? Like when I first experienced loss, I'd have people all the time that would say things like, I'm so sorry, but you know what? You know what? They're in a better place, right? And I get that's meant to try to make me feel better, but it also minimizes my grief. What I hear you saying is you shouldn't be as sad as you are. And so take a look at the statements that you are using to people in grief and realize, are you accidentally being self-serving and trying to fix their grief? Because you can't. Sometimes saying, that really sucks. That really sucks can be the most powerful thing that you can say to somebody who is processing grief versus trying to make it feel better or that. So when people first come back, check in on them very, very frequently. Be observant, give them options for how they need to process their grief, but don't tell them which one is right. Right. And that could sound like, if you have a day where you need to not be at work, let me know. I won't ask questions. I will trust, because I know that you're still processing the grief from this. Or you are at work. Do you need a different working environment? Do you need amended hours? Does it help you when I check in, or would you rather I not check in? Do you want the rest of the team to know? How much would you like them to know? So it's really just letting that person, and look, the answer that you may get from them is, I don't know. Because when you process grief, physically, you're in shock for a while. You actually don't. You don't recognize that you're grieving for a while. It's shock. And then everything you come across is shock. So that person might be like, I don't know. And you might hear them say, I'm fine. If you know that somebody has just gone through grief and they're telling you, I'm fine, they're not fine. Doesn't mean you have to be like, you're not fine. but
right.
Note, and you're like, I'm going to keep checking on them and proactively offering non-solutioning kindness and let them know that they're in a safe place to be a human.
Yeah. No, that's great. What, you mentioned, kind of thinking about leaders and managers and kind of how to approach in your mind, what is at risk here? Like, if it goes unchecked, like the support goes unchecked, people like you who maybe don't see the whole picture, the whole human behind the desk, like, what happens in those situations, do you think?
I mean, if you ignore your employees' full human experience, you ignore the biggest opportunity to show them that you care where it means the most. And look, I know more than anybody, anyone who's experienced any kind of loss knows, and this is one thing I talk about all the time, is that time is the most precious resource. It is limited. We don't know how much we have. Once we spend it, it's gone. And today could be the end of the time that we have, and we don't know that. And what that means is every moment of time that you are spending somewhere with someone doing something, they are offering up that resource to you. And so we look at that at work. How much time do we all spend at work? Right? The least that you can do for people is acknowledge the fact that they are a full human being. And this is also where this idea of identity versus role feedback comes in, right? So when somebody is grieving, I can't give them feedback on how to feel or what's the right thing to feel or how, but what I can do is I can give them feedback on the behavior, right? So you just had a very difficult thing happen and you came into the office and you are angry and you are disturbed and you are emotional and you walk in and you punch a hole in a monitor. Okay, I acknowledge the feelings. However, a way to display those feelings at work, perhaps we're not punching monitors and breaking company equipment. Perhaps we can give you a different outlet to help you process that anger. If being at work is the appropriate place to do that, we'll make a safe place. If not being at work is the appropriate place to do that, you have the freedom without worrying about the job loss to go ahead and process that feeling, not in a place where you're going to cause destruction. So by not addressing it, you risk bad behavior, you risk bad culture, you risk morale decline. And that's not just going to bleed internally to all of your companies, it's going to bleed externally to your customers and your prospects, right? Bad culture companies cannot succeed. And one of the first things you can do with culture is be a human first company.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. Real quick, I'm gonna hit the chat real quick. Hey, Charlie, I see this. I've got a lot of ideas for you to help you get that over the line. Let's connect offline here, and we can certainly help some tools that we've got for you, some talk tracks that we can help with. Lisa asks, and I'm going to pop this up here for you, Christina. Did you develop an approach to sharing with peers or leaders that never had to deal with the grief level that you were going through?
Yeah, in the right way. So most of the time, I've shared my story or bits of my story in one-on-one conversations where it was relevant and where it would help to build a relationship to show understanding. One of the other things that I've done is I've studied professional and personal communication for the last 12 years and how that shows up at work. And so I've used a lot of those skills when I have had to talk to folks. And you can tell if it's, do they need me to listen? Do they need me to solution for them? Are they looking for me to also share? Are they showing something that is very personal to themselves? And sometimes when people share something really personal, all of a sudden they feel very exposed, right? And they just shared something and they go, oh my God, was that an overshare? Is she going to understand that? Is this going to impact my job? Now she's going to think that I'm weak or super emotional. She's going to think that I can't do that. And I can see, and I know for a fact that spiraling has happened when somebody for the first time share something really vulnerable in a professional, high stakes work environment. I know immediately there's that icy, like, oh my God, I shared something really, really personal. Right. And in those moments when I see that, a great medicine is to one say, I so appreciate you feeling safe to share that. And to be honest, I can share too. You know, I lost my mom, right? And you can share in that moment and say, so I understand what you're feeling. And then you can ask a very, very specific question around that shows, hey, I understand what you're going through, but we're going to keep the conversation about you. And so where it's appropriate, I will share. I very rarely sat down with someone like I have here and been like, so here's my story. Like it's like bits and pieces that I will use. And it's almost always not to be self-serving. I'm actually, believe it or not, somewhat, if it were just up to me, I'm very shy about telling my story because as a female mother leader in technology, it's terrifying for me to show what some people will view as weakness. That's very scary for me. But I also know that it helps a lot of people to hear that strength doesn't always look the way that we think that it does. So I've had to find a balance.
That's great. And as you were talking about this and kind of the reaction to these moments, our friend Ashley Hurd, who runs a company called Manager Methods, has been on this program before and talked a lot about like the prerequisite to those things happening, like setting the expectation up front with the team. Like, hey, life is going to happen. Right? It could mean this could happen. All these things could happen to us. And when those things happen, not if, but when those things happen, here's how we act as a team. Here are the things that we do. Right. So she's already talking about like making it okay to have these conversations, making sure that people have the comfort and permission and space to do that, but also feel really equipped to be able to bring these tough situations up in hopefully a more comfortable manner than had the organization and the leadership not made that okay. Right. And that's something that I think back on my management. I'm like, oh man, that would have been so great to just have that conversation early on to make sure people feel safe with it.
Right.
I'm also going to throw Matt Trotsky up here, Christina. Matt's a good friend of Bereave, so I love this question. I ponder compartmentalization a lot, easy for me to say, as it can be healthy and unhealthy coping mechanism. What is your lived experience with that, given that it sounds like you had to carry on your finances, your sister, et cetera?
Oh my gosh, my lived experience is it's been a mess. It's been a controlled mess. And I say that because again, it's like grief and life experiences are not neat and tidy. And I actually, what going through the things that I have forced me to do is to get really good at compartmentalizing. So I'm almost an evil genius with it, where I can actually do that. But to your point, it's not always the healthiest thing to do, because I talked about kind of that Kool-Aid man busting through the wall. It's like, if you have these things sitting in boxes and all the boxes are the same size and they're all next to each other, which is what happens sometimes, then you have the grief of losing parents next to the job that I have to get done at work today, next to the relationship that I am trying to make sure is successful and thriving, next to being a parent, next to being a caregiver, next to the loss of a child, right? And they're all on this shelf. And throughout the day, the ones that are kind of scary, you're like, I'm you know what? Okay. And you pull the other boxes and you keep pulling in their boxes and pulling in their boxes. And then those other boxes start to degrade and degrade and degrade and degrade. And before you know it, things start slipping out of those boxes, right? When you're not expecting them to. And they show up in very, very strange places. And that's happened to me. I've had moments before when I've been on stage doing a keynote in front of 10,000 people, and something that I say triggers something to slip out of a box that I haven't talked about. And I will feel myself physically choke up on stage and have to take a minute and swallow it down and kind of keep going. Right. And so I don't want to say that there's a solution to that. I will be the first. There is no perfect way to handle grief outside of being aware of the fact that it is there and using it to serve yourself as much as you possibly can. But there's no perfect way to do it. It's difficult.
Sure. I'm gonna switch gears here just for a second, kind of go back into the workplace.
Yeah.
I want to, we get asked about policy a lot, just as Charlie mentioned earlier, right? We get asked about typically like, hey, how many days should we give for this relative, and how many days should we give from that relative? And that's not the conversation that we typically have, right? And I won't go down that path right now, but when it comes to the role of policy and creating policy, knowing what you know about the mental and physical impacts of grief, how would you think through creating policy? And maybe this actually helps Charlie, creating policy as a CEO in these moments for the team when your team at Lustre gets bigger. Like, how are you thinking through this?
Yeah, it's difficult because as a business person, as a CEO, as a former revenue leader at a variety of different companies, putting my business hat on for a moment, there is a big difference between work life and personal life, in a sense of, you go to work, you are paid to be there. There is a job that needs to get done. There are deliverables that have to happen, and those things have to happen. And I also know, and I've seen examples, and they devastate me, of people taking advantage of these types of policies. And it makes it very difficult for people in a leadership position to be able to say, well, how can I say that Christina is taking advantage of a bereavement policy, but Justin isn't? Like, how do I become the finder of fact in that moment? And that also can kind of get you into a really, really slippery HR place. And so the first thing that I would do is, most policies, it's going to be really difficult when it comes for bereavement to try to assign and scale how many days based on the loss. It's a little bit more difficult, but the thing that I would do at first is, if somebody has experienced a loss and they would like to utilize the bereavement policy, one, make sure that that policy is the same for everybody. So how much are you awarded job safe leave? Is there any payment that's involved with that? When does short or long-term disability have to come into play, right? Think about all of those things. So we know, okay, I'm tapping bereavement. And then it kind of comes down to, it could be a conversation with your manager. It could be something that you submit, but how many days of bereavement would you like to take? Right. And so get an idea first of this person's idea of, like, yeah, I just went through this giant loss. Somebody might say, I need a couple days. I need 2 days. Somebody might say, I need a week. Somebody might say, I need a month. Right now, whether you approve that month or not, it's the conversation there that is important, because if you automatically award everybody 3 days of bereavement for the loss of X, and that person's like, I only needed 1. Awesome. Right. That's cool for them to get a couple of extra days to go ahead and process that. And we love that. But for the person that's like, I need way longer than 3 days, what they're going to do is they're going to take the 3 days, they're going to come back to work, and they're going to phone it in for a month. Right. So it's better to know ahead of time, how much time do you need? And based on what they say, you work together to determine a set amount of bereavement that they are able to go and take that feels applicable for both sides. After they take that bereavement, there is a check-in again. And the check-in again is, are you fully capable of doing the job that you need to do and being measured the way that you do, or not? And if not, Can we make accommodations to make that better or easier for you? And so for me, the lesson is there has to be a conversation around this, because it is a workplace and there is no one size fits all with grief. And so that conversation is really, really important. And you will start to come out with averages that people need. You can make certain suggestions, but people appreciate the conversation almost more than they do a set policy. There's that ability of, my grief is specific to me. The thing happening to me is specific to me, and my organization is going to work with me because it's unique, versus, well, everybody that loses a sibling at work gets 7 days, so I guess I get 7 days. It just feels so much older that way.
Sure. Yeah. And it's wild. And it will always be wild to me for, just comparing it to parental leave. Right. And I know parental leave has made, astounding strides in the past 15 years, still very much a long way to go, but astounding strides compared to where we were in even like 2010. But we encourage companies to kind of, and leaders to kind of back up, right? And it's to think less about the days based on a relationship, and start to think about, why do we have these policies in the first place? Why do we offer a 90-day paid parental leave? What is the answer to that question? And then look across the rest of the leave policies and figure out, hey, does that align? Do these policies align with one another? To promote things like retention, which is, I'm sure, probably the biggest one, being human, culture, those types of things are very important here. But being able to kind of back out of there. And I think to your point, one of the things that we see the most is flexibility, right? Making sure there's a conversation. We coach on conversations. It's in our platform, but making sure that there is dialogue throughout, especially upon return and reentry. And I'm curious, because these conversations usually get started with a teammate who suffers a loss. They go to their manager and say, hey, this just happened. What do I do? And then that manager often goes to HR and kind of like hands it off in a lot of ways, right? Yeah. Not all the time, but we hear that a lot. In your mind, right, what is the role of a manager and their responsibilities when a direct report suffers a loss?
It's an interesting position to be in, because the individual who has experienced the loss might have a relationship with their manager where they feel like they want to share and they want their help and they want their support. They also may not. And that's where it gets really tricky, especially if it's something more sensitive, right? So think of a situation where you have a female direct report who is maybe going through a miscarriage or something inherently uncomfortable, and they have to go to their male boss and explain what's happening to their body. Like, they may not necessarily feel safe or comfortable explaining that. Or they may question whether their grief actually qualifies as grief and not feel comfortable talking about that either. Because one of the things that still has such a stigma at work is accepting the fact that mental health and mental illness is just the same as physical health and physical illness, right? A lot of times if people are struggling mentally, right, it's this invisible disability that they have where they can't talk about it. They don't feel comfortable and they feel like it doesn't qualify for grief. I'm just having suicidal thoughts, right? Like, I've had this actually happen before where people feel like it doesn't qualify. It's not like somebody died, right? But this is why we don't compare. So the first thing that I would say is the role for the manager is you have to understand what your relationship is with your people. I would say in most cases, when somebody says, I just experienced this loss or had their thing, a great rule of thumb is you automatically give them 2 full days where they're able to go off, no questions asked, right? We don't have to do anything today. We have to get no approvals today. Take 2 business days from work if you need them, and just go take time and take a moment. At the end of those 2 days, I'm going to send you an email that lets you know what the steps we're going to do to make sure that you can live out the rest of your bereavement. And the options there could be, do you want to work directly with your manager to facilitate the bereavement, or do you want to work directly with HR to facilitate the bereavement? And you let the employee one kind of say, okay, great, thanks. And what they're going to do is they're going to go, okay, I'm going to go, I'm not going to think about that now. We'll read it now when you send it. And that's really what they need. What they don't want is, hey, terrible news. My mom passed away. And manager's like, okay, great. So what you have to do now is they don't want a list of like, go do all these things. What they want is for you to say, go.
Yeah, we got you.
Go. Yeah.
Yep. Gotcha. Super helpful. Christina, I've got one more question, because you referenced earlier balancing the human element with the business element, right? With kind of the history of bereavement and how it's unfolded and how leaders think through policy when they think about relationships and scoring grief, as Matt Trotsky referred to it. I'm super curious, like if you had one message for business leaders, from your experience, both your own lived experience and the experience of managing people who have gone through something similar, what is your message to them about how they should be thinking about grief as it relates to their workforce?
Yeah. The first thing is that everybody, you included, leader that we are talking about, everybody has dealt with grief that is massive to them in some way, shape, or form. And that grief has shaped who they are. And your job as a leader is to take the entirety of a person and show them how to use it as their strengths. So acknowledge the fact that everybody has had their own version of hardship and it is showing up every single day, whether you realize that or not. And your job is to make yourself an open and available person where people feel like they can show up and be their true selves. Your job as a leader is to make sure that nobody ever feels like their job is going to be in jeopardy, their skills are going to be questioned, their promotion path is going to be impacted because they've been hit by grief that they can't control. And so creating an environment of safety, an environment of empathy, an environment of openness, that's your job as a leader, is to facilitate. Because when you show people that you care deeply at that level, now you can challenge them directly when it comes to work. It's we're talking down a little bit of a radical candor talk here a little bit, but showing people that you care personally gives you the right to show that you're an advocate for them and you're going to help them get to where they need to go in life. And so don't forget that and think that people have it easy. Everyone's got a story that you're not aware of. I firmly believe that every human being is actually an iceberg and we're just seeing the very tip.
Sure. Yeah. Very much like I've seen you for the past 5 years, right? Didn't know it was underneath the water until today.
Yeah.
So, Christina, thank you for your time and for sharing. I think your just willingness to be a part of this conversation, and you've said it from almost day one of me starting here. You're clearly working to impact the way leaders show up, managers show up, the ability for people to show up as people in the workplace, and I really hope that the folks at Lustre, and that Lustre has the great opportunity to be able to hire folks and to be able to benefit from the way you think about life and as it relates to work and your leadership. So couldn't be more grateful for your vulnerability and generosity today. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for the platform to share these kinds of things. It's so needed. Sure. So I appreciate you right back.
Got it. If you're listening and like Charlie Roberts, are thinking about making change at your workplace on the topic of bereavement, we're here to guide you in making that change, whether you're a customer or not. You don't have to pay us to call us to have a conversation about how to help. That is a big part of our mission, and we are here to serve in that manner. Coming up in August, we've got a couple of cool things. One that we're working on the second week of August, working to tee up a really interesting conversation around benefit trends, and more details will be coming soon. Looking forward to seeing you, but then be well. Thanks, everybody.